So we're very, very pleased this morning to have Hugh Amoore, who is familiar to many, many of you. As you know, a very long association with the University of Cape Town in various roles, and of course, most importantly, as the registrar for almost 3 decades. He was the registrar, and only two years ago now that Hugh actually retired. And until recently, the chair or president of our Legacy Society was Francis Wilson, who took over when Stephen Saunders stepped down. And so we were really thought quite hard about who should we approach to succeed Francis. And Hugh Amoore's name came up and was pretty obvious. And we were quite thrilled when he agreed that he would become the next chairperson of our, did we say chairperson or president? President for him, the next president of our Legacy Society. So this is his first formal event as president of the Legacy Society. So warm welcome, Hugh, and thanks for as I said, he needs no introduction. His commitment to UCT, his involvement in UCT, his understanding of the university's contribution over all of those years has been immeasurable, and so we can't really think of a better president of our Legacy Society. So I'm going to hand over to you, who's going to address us for probably 20-30 minutes, and then we will have an occasion to have some conversations, questions and answers. I'm sure many of you are really raring to ask questions. You know, we're in an exciting transition at the university. As you know, we have a new Vice Chancellor designate, Professor Nomageti Pakeng. And so the university is in a process of change as well, so it's quite an exciting time. So you, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to many friends and colleagues and supporters of UCT. I thought that I would ask a few questions this morning about what fee-free higher education actually means and some of the complexities of it. I can't get to the full depth of it in 20 minutes, but just to provoke some thought and some discussion, I thought I would ask 6 questions. What did the President actually say on the 16th of December? The second one, what is a fee? In other words, what is free? That takes some unraveling, as we'll see. What does a fee cover? What does the national budget provide in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021? And what does it not provide as a result of fee-free higher education? And then what does this mean for schools, for TVET colleges, and for universities? Just to try to start unpacking some of what it means. Well, I think we need to go back to October 2015. Take yourself back to that week leading up to Friday the 23rd of October. The country was virtually brought to a standstill by student protests. And ultimately, with the protests on the lawns of the union buildings, the president caved in and announced that there would be no fee increase for universities in 2016. That was the beginning of it. We subsequently had the Hare Commission. It reported, and then in December 2017, out of the blue, the president made his announcement. And I think it's just important to reflect on what he actually said. He started off by talking about the need to address the questions of poverty. And I'll read from his statement. Noting on, this would have been on the slide, so excuse me reading down. Noting our nation's staggering levels of income inequality and considering the definition of poor and working class students that has remained stagnant, that was the NSFAS allocation, that has remained stagnant and outdated despite the escalating costs of living and studying, and in order to maximize the developmental impact of our pro-poor higher education policies,
The definition of poor and working class students will now refer to, quote, currently, and this is technically very important, currently enrolled TVET college or university students from South African households with a combined annual income of up to 350,000 by 2018 academic year. And then he goes on to say that the Minister of Higher Education, in consultation with the Minister of Finance, will revise that level each year. That will be quite a difficult thing for them to do, I think. Then he says, having amended the definition of poor and working class students, government will introduce fully subsidized free higher education and training for poor and working class students. Students categorized as poor and working class under the new definition will be funded and supported through government grants, not loans. Then he goes on to say, and this is really important because this hasn't yet been given effect. In order to achieve its intended targets of access and success, fully subsidized costs of study will include tuition fee. That I think most people understood from the statement. But he goes on, prescribed study material. What does that mean? Prescribed study material. So you can prescribe textbooks and presumably that's got to be covered somehow. Meals, accommodation, and includes transport. Again, what does it mean by includes transport? I'm simply reading President Zuma's December 16 statement. And of course, the 16th of December is an interesting date for him to have chosen. It wasn't just before the elective Congress. I think there was much more to it, given the importance of that date. And then he goes on to deal with historic debt, and he says, with a wonderful irony, the matter in relation to the management of NSFAS historic debt, due to its complexity, will be dealt with by the Minister of Higher Education in consultation with the Minister of Finance. So recognizing that one they didn't have a solution to. The rest is solved by this blanket statement. Okay, what is a fee? Now, one of our sister universities has, through one of its spokesmen, recently made the point, why should the state unequally subsidize UCT and not us? And the following figures will give you an indication of what's behind that. So some indicative UCT tuition fees for 2018. A Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Business Science, and it depends on what subjects you choose, because with course-based fees, getting an indicative degree fee is not that simple. But the indicative fees for 2018 for UCT for a Bachelor of Commerce are somewhere between 55 and 70,000. That's the tuition fee for the year. Actuarial science around 70,000, architectural studies around 60,000, medicine is 70,000. Okay, law 50,000. In addition, so roughly between 50,000 at the bottom and just over 70,000 at the top is the tuition fee. As we'll see later, that is an all-inclusive fee that covers everything. There are no add-ons after that. And that's important in comparison to what many universities in South Africa do. Housing, well, a residence room, if it's a single room, will cost somewhere around 55,000 a year, and you add to that full meals, and it's another 20,000. But at UWC, if you're doing a BSc or a dental degree, your fee is around 35,000. Okay, so the state is paying the fee for a person at UCT whose combined income is under 350,000 of somewhere around 70,000, and is paying the fee at UWC for a person whose family income is the same order of half that number. The state can't sustain that indefinitely, and it's going to have some very serious implications for universities right around the country. For the last 3 years, universities have been constrained by ministerial, well, first presidential and then ministerial edict, to the maximum percentage that they could raise their fees. Well, without that constraint, if you were sitting at the University of Zululand, where over 95% of your undergraduates would qualify under the fee-free higher education, if you didn't have a limit on increasing your fees, the answer is obvious. You put your fee levels up to where UCTs are, and you more than double your tuition fee income. That hasn't been factored in to the national budget. It hasn't been factored in because there is currently this gentleman's agreement, because it's not enforceable in law, that those fees will not be increased by more than a certain percentage. How's that going to work itself out? I mean, it's a really interesting and tough question. Okay. Just in terms of what the fee is, one of our other sister universities, not the one I've categorized or given examples of its fees, gives you a fee, but then adds on. If you use university Wi-Fi, you pay an extra amount. If you use the libraries, you pay an extra amount. Is that part of the fee that is free, or is that something that you have to pay in addition? These user fees, are they part of the fee or not? I think that university has deliberately charged for those things separately in order to give the impression that its tuition fee is actually lower than what you pay. At UCT, what you pay is what you get everything for that. There is no additional charge, and that includes the Jammy Shuttle, which is one of the really important ancillary things, and it certainly is a pro-poor issue. One of the biggest beneficiaries of the Jammy Shuttle are the workers who used to have to get a bus from the Mowbray transport interchange up onto the campus. It's now free for them. So those sorts of things are part of the UCT fee. They are not part of the fees at many other universities in South Africa. Again, this raises a question. And the question that it raises, and must be vexing the Department of Higher Education, is what's the national department's attitude to the determination of a fee and what a fee should cover? Are we going to get to something like the UK, where fees are set and prescribed by the Secretary of Education, as opposed to our current position, where university councils, as autonomous governing bodies of juristic personalities, can determine the tuition fees and other fees applicable? I mean, that's on the table, because if you have fee-free higher education, the state must be able to say, what is the fee for which we are going to pay? It raises the next question, is do we have a fee for those families whose gross income is less than 350,000, and another fee for the others, just as we have a fee for international students and a fee for South Africans and nationals and South African residents? Again, that is a question which is going to have to be faced in dealing with this dilemma. But I think it is important to remember that the UCT fee, unlike I think every other university in the country, is comprehensive. Now let's just look at the national budget. And I think I'll try and summarize these numbers. They would have been easier to see on a screen. But I think what is really important about the national budget is how much is being cut from other departments and how much is going to fee-free higher education. The Department of Science and Technology, for example, and that's not unimportant for universities because it funds a lot of things in universities. It's had its 2018-19 budget cut in nominal terms by 14%. Okay? That's in nominal terms. You add the increase in costs. I mean, that is a significant. You take effectively the 20% spending power out of the Department of Science and Technology. What are you left with? It's not just science and technology, it's across the board. Provincial governments, in terms of the Division of Revenue Act, have had their allocations cut. and that filters down to schools and to hospitals. So there are major things. Now let's just look at what in fact, the amount of money that was given in the 2018-19 budget, the additional allocations. The first line item was when in 2015 the President announced that there would be no fee increase in 2016, there was an agreement that the state would make up the difference up to an 8% increase in the fee that universities would have had if they had been allowed to increase their fees. And that was 8% of universities' fees, and I've shown earlier that's 8% of an unequal fee from one university to another. So universities like Wits, Stellenbosch and Cape Town did quite well out of that because they got the cash for what would have been an 8% increase. At the University of Zululand, where the fee is not half of the UCT, but even lower, they got 8% of an even lower amount. Okay, they got what they would have budgeted for. But in terms of the distribution of public money, there was a differential, a very significant differential. So the first line in the budget for 2018-19 and through to 2021 is to carry through this amount, this additional amount, to make up for the fee increases that haven't been implemented. And that's 2.4 billion in 2018, 4 billion in 2019, and nearly 5 billion in 2021. It's a total of 11 billion over the period. Then the new allocations for 2018-19, remember, it's first years only at the moment who get fee-free higher education, the others get NSFAS funding. That is just under 5 billion, and that goes up to 15 billion in the third year, a total over that medium-term framework period of 33 billion. What's, I think, escaped most people's notice is the impact on the TVET colleges. Now, just stepping back for a moment, we have roughly just under 1 million students, including UNISA's 330,000. We have roughly 1 million students in universities in South Africa. So it's 650, roughly, these are round figures, in the residential universities. We now have, not all full-time, 700,000 students in the TVET colleges. And the impact of the December 16 statement on the TVET colleges, and therefore potentially on the country, is much more significant than its impact on the universities, because the first thing that the budget has done has increased the subsidy for TVET colleges on their normal costs from 50 to 80%. Think back 30 years when the subsidy formula was revised, universities got 80% of their funding by way of a grant from the state. It's now less than 50. But the TVET colleges have now been ramped up to 80%. In addition to which, most of the students in the TVET colleges come from families with a gross family income of less than 350,000. So there will be fee-free higher education in the TVET colleges. The NSFAS grants to TVET college have always been grants, not loans. But they have been income dependent, and effectively if you were over 150,000 gross family income, you didn't get the NSFAS grant. That now falls away at 350,000, and anybody with a family income of 350,000 will be free at a TVET college for the tuition fee. Where there is housing, and most of the TVET colleges don't have it, that might be dealt with. We'll come to that later. But so the TVET college subsidy funding goes up over the medium period by 6.5 billion, and the student funding goes up by 10 billion over that period. Very substantial amount. It's going to make the TVET colleges, where they can run themselves effectively, financially secure, and it's going to make access to TVET colleges much more affordable, well, affordable, not much more affordable, affordable for the poor. And I think that we're going to see, I suspect, a profound change. But remember, TVET colleges do a whole lot of things. They take people who have exited school at grade 9, and they take people who've exited school at grade 12. And different TVET colleges have a different ranges of courses. That's something that needs a lot of attention in the TVET sector. But the state's 2030 plan is to increase the number of students in the TVET colleges from the current 700,000 to 2.5 million. That's 2.5 million, yes. Yeah. Well, if one looks at the number of people in a cohort, I mean, in a TVET college you'll have a lot of adults as well. An age cohort in South Africa is about 1.2 million people. So if 1.2 million people are going to be accommodated, and let's assume you've got them there for 3 or 4 years, well, 4 years is 5 million people. Not all of those are going to be in any form of further or higher education, but they want 2.5 million to those be in the TVET colleges in 2030. So again, this fee-free and subsidy implication, the Minister of Finance has given the short-term impact of it. The impact further is going to be much greater. TVET college infrastructure got another 4.5 billion. That's really important because their infrastructure is really woeful. And there are a few other bits and pieces. But, okay, so that's what the national budget basically is. I'll skip a few of the details. But I think it's important to remember that in terms of the additional allocations in the budget for 2018-19, the total additional allocation was 14 billion, of which 12.5 billion goes to higher education. The rest, doesn't matter what it is, gets 1.8 billion. So the additional allocations in the 2018-19 budget go almost entirely to higher education. So we need to look at what that meant. Now, the government has been trying to reduce the expenditure ceiling simply because we're borrowing too much. And the intention was to do that progressively over the next 5 years. Well, for 2018-19, in order to try to do that, there have been baseline reductions, that's cuts, to government departments of 26 billion. That was what was in the budget before the 16th of December. But then comes along the additional 14 billion of additional expenditures, most of which goes to higher education. So the expenditure ceiling projections have gone out of the window, even with that. And that, I think, has huge consequences in the long term for the country. Now, what's not in the national budget? Well, if one looks just at the education sector, one of the things which the Department of Basic Education has been valiantly trying to do, with some success, I must say, is to introduce proper early childhood development training throughout the country. Last year alone, they distributed just under 4 million workbooks for ECD across the country. But the plan was to make grade R, the reception year, universal by 2019, if funding allows. Well, I'm sorry, but funding no longer allows. So one of the major planks of education reform, which is ECD and grade R, takes a backseat. And this is one of the issues that I think if we're concerned about education, we should really be worried about, is the emphasis that has been placed on fee-free higher education means that other things suffer. But if we look at universities, we have another problem, because the subsidies have not been increased. The subsidy rates have not been increased. If you're involved in research funding in universities, you'll know that the mushrooming, if that's the right word to use, of the number, not necessarily the quality, the number of publications that count for subsidy has meant that the unit value of a subsidy, in other words, the amount of money that a university earns for a publication, has dropped very substantially over the last decade. In real terms, it's come down hugely. So universities are getting less money, and there's acceptance, even at National Treasury level, that our universities are underfunded. The state paying the fees for those who couldn't otherwise afford all of the fee or to get a loan doesn't change the bottom line revenue of a university by 1 cent. It simply says the fees will be paid. Okay, in the case of some universities, that does mean that their fee debt problems may vanish. So for those universities, and I think of a place like Walter Sisulu, for example, that will make a difference because they won't have a fee debt from the people who would otherwise have been billed a fee but didn't pay. But for a university like UCT or Stellenbosch or Wits or Rhodes or Natal or Pretoria, the fact that the state is paying the fees of the students with a family income of less than 350,000 makes no difference to the bottom line. The systemic underfunding of the sector remains. So that's the second issue that should concern us in relation to this. But what we should be concerned as citizens, of course, is what happens elsewhere, is that the higher education noise, I think of Ferguson's wonderful statement about his noisy neighbours at Manchester City. I mean, the noisy neighbours of the students have meant that that particular narrow sector of public expenditure is funded at the expense of everything else. Not just the expense of everything else, but also the expense of proper funding for the universities. The next thing one has to look at is who gets this funding. Now here, again is a problem that is vexing national education and NSFAS. For how long, if you come from a family with a gross family income of less than 350,000, does the state continue to give you this form of social grant? Because let's face it, that's what it is. It's a form of social grant. If you simply stay on and on and on, can you cash in your chips for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years? NSFAS has been trying in the last 5 years to say, actually, no, you've got to make adequate progress before the funding will be continued. And that has worked in many cases, but it's still an inexact tool, and it does need to be sharpened, because otherwise we are going to see this bill mushrooming again, simply because people will stay on and stay on. From the state's point of view, it has, for the last decade or so, forced universities to manage their enrollment planning. So that, in a sense, the state's bill for the number of students is capped because they have introduced this device that if you over-enroll, you are going to get your baseline subsidy cut. Not just kept at the level of your prediction, but actually cut. So that tool forces universities not to over-enroll. So you can't simply say, if you're a university of X, well, we'll take in every possible fee-paying student who has a gross family income of 350,000 because we know their fees will be paid. I mean, that sort of ruse is now not possible, fortunately, and the department has put in effective measures to stop it. I might say that that sort of measure is necessary. When the first subsidy formula, first headcount subsidy formula for universities was introduced in the 1970s, the Canny University, registrar of a university in the north, in those days, after the Van Wyk de Vries Commission, you got subsidy on the number of enrolled students you had. And there was only one cap, and that is that a student could only be enrolled for a 3-year degree for 5 years, a 4-year degree for 6 years, and so on and so forth. But if they were enrolled, you got the subsidy. So he got together the full administrative staff of his university, and he said, in Afrikaans, you are all going to enroll for the next qualification for which you're eligible in 1976. And they did. You don't need to pay class fee. You don't have to pay class fees. You must just pay your registration fee. And for 3 or 4 years, that university got away with it. I mean, you know, subsidy fodder of the worst possible sort. But in fact, that sort of loophole, fortunately, now doesn't exist. The TVETs are not under the same constraint in terms of subsidy, but they are under a constraint in terms of resources. They're simply, most of them don't have the capacity, both in terms of human and physical resources, to enroll more students. So there is a limit on that. But I think it is important just to recognize what this means for TVET and university budgets. There's another issue that's going to be faced by the department for universities like Cape Town, and that is that 8% subsidy is not going to continue. They've got to put that into the baseline. When it comes into the baseline, it will be equal for the universities with high fees and the universities with low fees. And so the net amount that UCT will get will be less. So we are going to face some really tough issues because of fee-free higher education. It's going to be good for the TVET colleges. It's going to be good for families that have a gross family income of less than 350,000. But it's going to skew it has skewed national priorities, and it does mean that money that otherwise might have been argued for the real basic needs of universities is simply not there. If you're in a government department other than in higher education and training, if you're a minister responsible for it, you're going to look pretty askance at the Minister of Higher Education coming to Cabinet asking for more money for the universities, when your budgets for 2018, 19, 20, and 2021 have been cut. So I think it's going to be a tough time for the new minister, and it's going to be a tough time for universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were very insightful and also a lot of questions. So I invite comments, questions.
Renfrew Christie. Hugh, wonderful talk as usual. We are seeing a foreshadowing of merging of departments, and in particular of higher education and science and technology. What opportunity is there for a sensible rationalization of the two budgets, for looking after research properly? If you were advising a lady, assuming she's a minister, what would you say?
I would, if I was Naledi as the Minister of Higher Education and Training, I would argue strongly against a merger of DST and higher education and training. I think DST is able better to protect the science budget than a merged department would be. On the other hand, I would argue strongly for going back to a single Department of Education and merging basic and higher education and training. I mean, one of the areas which is most neglected at the moment, although the TVET College will address some part of it, is adult education. And the problem of this is that the mandate given to higher education and training is to deal with all adult education, including adult education at NQF level 1, in other words, basic reading and writing. That's a mandate of higher education and training, not basic education. At the moment, we have got confusion between the two departments about the space between effectively grade 9 exiters and entry into a proper technical vocational qualification in TVT and a university. So there's a grey area there that's a mess. So that was what I would argue for. So I'm afraid of deflecting your question, Renfrew. I wouldn't go for DST and higher education merging, because I think DST is better able to protect the science vote than on its own than it would be in a merged department.
But it might be what we get.
I hope not, but it might be.
Take three. We'll start there and gentlemen.
Mr. President, thank you for a very alarming talk. I have two comments. Firstly, at the Medical Association's monthly meeting last month, we were told that Western Cape Department of Health's budget that is currently reduced by 89 billion rands. This leads to the next question, but I resist the temptation not to elaborate. From where is the money going to come for national health insurance? My second comment is that I'm very concerned that our Minister of Higher Education has not learned from the mistake that was made 50 years ago by the late unlamented Harold Wilson in Britain, who expanded tertiary education to such an extent where there is, especially in the humanities, a large number of unemployed and underemployed university graduates. Thank you.
I have a narrower question about UCT itself. It seems to me that it's taking in more and more and more students. And last year, I think we had something like 29,500 students. And the situation on Upper Campus is really very bad. There's no place, you can only get a parking place at the PD1 building if you pitch up at 5 in the morning. The situation is absurd, and there's no place to go and dine properly and so on and so forth. It's overcrowded. It's overcrowded. And what is the policy of this expansion? We're growing like topsy more and more and more.
We understand the impact of having underprepared students coming into first year and having a high failure rate with a graduation rate, and what impact it has on the function of the university.
You will take those.
Right. Okay. The third question is, what is the impact, financial and otherwise, of underprepared students entering the first year? Underprepared people entering as first-year students. The second half of the first question and the second question, Luigi's question, are linked. The Harold Wilson and then Harold Macmillan and then Harold Wilson expansion of the UK education sector and the problems that has caused with underemployed graduates. I think we have a different situation in South Africa. I don't think that if we keep the number of university places more or less where it is, we are not going to be having, we won't be producing unemployed or underemployed graduates. The problem at the moment is that our university sector is hugely inefficient. And that's related to your question about underprepared students coming in. It's hugely inefficient in that of undergraduates who get into the university, a very significant proportion leave without a qualification. And until recently, until the change, a lot of the NSFAS students, in other words, the people funded by the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, left with nothing but debt. And the proportions were staggering. In some years, up to 50% of the exiting NSFAS students were leaving with debt and nothing else. 50%. The throughput rate of the South African higher education, if you leave UNISA aside, because I think one has to, UNISA's got a different mission, but if you take the residential universities, we're not near 60% throughput for undergraduates. UCT is way better than the average, but nationally we're not near 60% throughput, which means of those, the entering cohort, fewer than 60% leave with a degree. So the inefficiency of our sector is one of the most important things that needs to be addressed. Now, it is possible that fee-free higher education will take the burden of funding away from some students who are struggling, and that may help, but it's certainly not going to be the answer. I think that the extent to which the measures, and they've really been below the radar screen, the measures in the 2018-19 budget for TVET colleges, I think those are going to mean that more people are going to go to the TVET colleges who might otherwise have aspired to going to universities. So we may see a balancing of this. Your first part about the the cut to the provincial health budget, well, that's part of that 29 billion that was cut from all government departments in order to reduce the expenditure ceiling for the state. It's happening not just the Western Cape Department of Health, it's happening right around the country. I can't answer the second half of your question about where the NHI is funded from. But I have no doubt that in the budget discussions for 2019, 20, 2021, 22, and the next MTEF circle, the Minister of Health is going to be pounding as hard as he can to get funding equivalent to what's gone to higher education for the health sector to fund the NHI. And he has the backing of an ANC resolution to that effect. So watch this space. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really, really interesting question. Now, Luigi's question about UCT, I'm trying to keep out of UCT. I've retired 2.5 years ago, but I think it's instructive that if you take most of the world's leading universities by any ranking system that there is, UCT is bigger than most of them already. In fact, a lot of them are smaller than 15,000, 16,000 students. So size and the top universities in the world, there's no correlation. And that's an issue which I think we have to face. On the question of parking on the upper campus, well, the Jamie Shuttle has made the campus accessible to many, and it's been a huge success. But I think, one observation, I mean, the parking on the campus is now a 12-month problem. And if you go to the campus between Christmas and New Year, which is traditionally a closed period, there are still a lot of cars on the campus. If you go during a vac, there are a lot of cars on the campus. The university is working. There's one university in the north that aspires to be research-led or research-intensive. If you go there in the short vacations, there's not a car. It's unbelievable. I don't know how these universities exist, and they just close up shop, even for a 10-day short vac. So I think it's a good measure of UCT as well as a bad one, Luigi. On the question of underprepared students, that's the subject for another talk. I mean, I think there has been some improvement in the schooling in this country, and despite all the negative publicity that we get every year when the NSC results come out, they are better. But there's still a long way to go and a big gap, and universities have got to address that, but I can't deal with it now, I'm afraid. I mean, I think it's a huge issue, and it's related to that efficiency problem of which I spoke a moment ago.
Okay, thank you. Let's start here.
Oh, since they've answered, what is the...
In fact, there's nothing free.
Come here.
Somehow.
Come here.
I'm saying there's nothing free. There's nothing free. Yeah, so there's no free education whatsoever. Just a rhetoric, but somehow, somewhere, someone needs to pay something. So we need to take that into account, and that's very important. Now, in your own set, have you tried to find out whether elsewhere in the world similar project has been successful, or is there any place somewhere where actually this policy has been implemented successfully?
Thank you. Yeah.
Johan Maria, I just want to ask, what difference does it really make for a student coming to UCT that there now is going to be this free education? I was at the impression that UCT already had in place a policy that no student would be turned away if they accepted on financial grounds, that if they're low income, a total grant would be arranged. If they're somewhat intermediate, it would be a combination of grant and loan, and of course the ones who can afford it pay fully. So is it going to, at UCT, is it going to make much difference in terms of the student intake?
Okay, thanks.
And just one comment before I make it, and that is, there was a delegation that went to Brazil, and Brazil had free education. And there could be some lessons to be learned either way on that. But the question I'm asking is on accommodation. UCT has 6,800 beds available for students and has 29,500 roughly students. And that is, I think, a problem nationally. You mentioned a figure of 55,000 spent on accommodation per student, which is in Cape Town not a huge amount, given the escalation of what accommodation has gone, but obviously it would be cheaper in, say, Potchefstroom or somewhere like that. And is there any consideration about that as to how those fees for accommodation get spread around and solving the problem of accommodation in general?
Take a last one, David.
Very sad to leave, I don't want to.
I found that there was nothing in what you said that I disagreed with. I'm equally worried about the students and other areas not being funded. I also think that it could possibly help the TVETs in some sense and students under 350,000. I'm worried about is what lessons do you draw from what you say? And I want to add what I call a historical preface. I want to go back to 1993. But just before I go back to 1993, I was lucky last week. I went to the East Rand to run a workshop with two black women. They were about 30 years old. The one's parents were teachers and the other parents, her father was a plumber. The one from the parents one went, I didn't know this, and I thought I study higher education. I didn't realize how serious it was. She was a student in Boxburg at Wits 10 years ago, and she got NIFSAS covered quite a bit of her fees. By the second and third year, she found she couldn't travel from her parents' home from Boxburg to Wits, and she actually spent most of the second and third years sleeping in the library. That's at Wits. This is really the same. The Stellenbosch student was a woman from Athlone. The same situation. Her fees were paid at Stellenbosch, but she found by second and third year she couldn't, and she also slept in the Stellenbosch library with friends. Well, when I heard these stories, I thought back, I was somebody in 1993, part of NEPI, National Education Policy Initiative. 30 of us got together for 4 months to advise the ANC on higher education policy. And out of NEPI came, in 1995, the National Commission of Higher Education, NCHE, which recommended basic policy for the higher education in the new South Africa. What I feel is shocking, and I would like to say, Mea culpa, how is it possible that in our NEPI report and our NCHE report, we had hardly anything to say about the students with 350,000 and below? I challenge you, look at those reports. If we want to ask questions, and there are many questions that we need to ask, we need to go back to everybody in the room who was at university in 1993. What on earth were we thinking about? That we could leave out the central question of how poor students, 350,000 below, was not chapter number 1 in the NEPI and chapter number 2 in the NCHA report. What were we doing in that situation? And we need that preface. Otherwise we blame a whole lot of things without also looking at ourselves.
Thank you.
Okay, let me deal with Dave's question about this first, because I think I would add a footnote, an important footnote to his NEPI and NCHE story. Who started NSFAS? It was TEFSA at first, and then became NSFAS. Who started NSFAS? Who was the person who went to the then minister and then to the government and said, you've got to do something about it, went to the president? Stuart Saunders. Yeah. And the point is, it wasn't in NEPI and it wasn't in the NHC, but Stuart recognised, not just from a UCT perspective, but from a sector perspective, that funding for the poor student was the key issue. And it was a recognition that went back to the early 1980s, when the problems of getting black students to UCT were to fund them, to house them, and to deal with their academic underpreparedness. You had to deal with all three. And so when NEPI and the NCHE left that open, he went to the president and he went to the then Minister of Finance and said, you've got to do this. We tried to get them to there was 6 or 8 billion in the Sasria fund at the time, unused. We tried to get that money allocated to NSFAS, but they wouldn't hear of it. But that was the birth of NSFAS. If that Sasria money had gone into NSFAS or TEFSA at the beginning, we wouldn't have been in the problem we are today. Dave, I don't know. I was fortunately not part of either. No. No. In 1986, there were students sleeping in the UCT library. Make no mistake. We knew it. No. In 66, there were. No, in 66 there were not, but in the 70s and 80s there were. And the NCHE and NEPI didn't pick it up. I don't understand it, because we understood at UCT very firmly that that was the problem. Okay, that's that issue. You asked a question about other countries, and I'm going to use one country only. I think it's probably the more successful of the experiments of, you can go to Norway and rich countries which are able to do it. But let's take Australia. Australia has got a very interesting model. It's not free, you pay it back if you can. In other words, you pay it back if you earn enough to pay it back. And that's one of the more interesting models. Sorry, Johanni, your question was what difference does it make to UCT students who are under 350,000 or under 600,000? Well, under 350,000, it means that there will no longer be a loan component to their funding. And that's a big difference. For under 600,000, there will remain a loan component to their funding. Yeah, so that's the difference for the UCT person. Sorry? Yes, yeah. But so that's, in other words, that person, although we're not sure, because there's likely to be a capping of the amount of the fee, residence and other fees that the state will pay for. So there may still be a UCT component which may have to be part loan, part grant. But essentially, that's the key difference. Okay.
Thank you very much.